May 14, 1943. Dawn breaks over the Rue Valley. The pale sun struggles to cut through a sky already thick with smoke and contrails. Below, the earth trembles. Columns of fire claw upwards from flak bursts, painting the heavens with a deadly black haze. Rising above it all, like steel phantoms, are the unmistakable silhouettes of American bombers. Their wings stretch wide, their engines thundering with relentless purpose. The B-17 flying fortress. German spotters peer upward, their binoculars shaking not from the cold, but from dread. They had seen bombers before, they had brought them down before, but something about these ones, this formation, this defiance felt different. Bundesarchiv Luftwaffe Signals Report, May 1943. The first bursts of flak detonate with surgical precision, peppering the formation with steel shards. In theory, no plane could withstand this gauntlet for long. The German gunners brace themselves, waiting for the inevitable descent of burning wreckage. Instead, the bombers keep coming. One B-17 shudders as a direct hit rips through its fuselage. Smoke trails from its wingtip, flames lick its body, and yet, the giant refuses to fall. It stays locked in formation, limping forward like a wounded beast that refuses to kneel. Luftwaffe ground crews exchange glances of disbelief. 8th Air Force After Action Report, May 1943. Moments later, the shriek of Daimler-Benz engines fills the air. Messerschmitt Bf 109S and Focke-Wulf 190S dive like hawks from the sun. Their machine guns tear the sky into ribbons, tracers stitching across the bomber streams. German pilots expect panic, scattering, collapse. But the fortresses hold tight, their defensive guns swiveling in a deadly ballet. A hurricane of .50 caliber fire erupts from the formation, 13 guns per aircraft, each one spitting lead with mechanical fury. Pilots who once mocked these American machines now watch their comrades spiral earthward, wings torn and engines ablaze. Bundesarchiv, Pilot Debriefing Log, 1943. Inside one bomber, oxygen masks rattle as crewmen shout over the roar of engines and the deafening staccato of Brownings. The ball turret gunner, suspended beneath the belly of the plane in his glass sphere of death, squeezes the triggers until his hands cramp. Twin barrels glow red, smoke fills the turret, sweat stings his eyes. Above, the waist gunners call out positions like chess players under siege, bandits, 5 o'clock high. The bomber trembles with each hit, metal shrieking as it's peeled away by cannon shells, yet the wings remain steady. The beast refuses to die. Crew Diary, 390th Bomb Group, Fragment. From the ground, German civilians watch in stunned silence. The bombers look like castles drifting across the sky, their shadows crawling across the fields. Each one that takes damage but refuses to fall gnaws at morale. A child whispers to her mother, "Why don't they burn?" Her question hangs heavy in the air, even as fire pours from stricken engines, even as wings split open, the flying fortresses crawl forward, relentless as fate itself. Eyewitness account, Essen, 1943. A Bf-109 slices through the formation, hammering one bomber with 20 mm cannon shells. The fortress shudders violently, its tail nearly severed. The German pilot smirks. No aircraft could survive this. But his smile vanishes as the bomber, bleeding smoke, somehow rights itself. It stays in formation. It keeps flying. And when its bombs finally fall, they ripple through the Ruhr's factories with surgical devastation. The Luftwaffe pilot lands hours later, his face pale, his voice trembling. It was as if they were armored like battleships. Luftwaffe pilot debriefing, dramatized composite. For the crews inside, survival is a razor's edge. The bombardier, hunched over his Norden sight, guides the fortress through flak bursts like a helmsman in a storm. Shrapnel tears through the nose compartment, grazing his shoulder. He doesn't flinch. The pilot's knuckles turn white as he grips the controls, feeling the vibrations of damage coursing through his plane. Every instinct tells him to break off, to dive, to save his men. But the doctrine is clear: stay in formation. The power of the flying fortress isn't in one plane, but in the unbreakable shield of many. Technical Manual TM-130, Formation Flying, 1943. By midday, The sky is littered with wrecks, both Allied and German. Smoke trails mark the dying. But even as dozens of bombers fall, dozens more push forward. Their bombs fall on refineries, steelworks, rail yards. The earth shakes. The Ruhr burns. On the ground, Wehrmacht officers sift through wreckage of shot-down B-17 say. They marvel at the construction redundant systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating around crew stations. These weren't ordinary planes. They were fortresses in truth. Captured aircraft report. Luftwaffe Technical Division, 1943. Among the Germans, whispers spread. How could any airframe endure such punishment? Tales circulate of flying fortresses returning with half a wing, with holes big enough to walk through, with engines blown apart, yet still bringing crews home. Soldiers call them Die Fliegende Festung, the Flying Fortress. It is no nickname, but a statement of grudging respect. Each raid that follows, the dread grows heavier. For every bomber shot down, another seems to shrug off death and drop its payload. Bundesarchiv, Soldier Letter Home, June 1943. By nightfall, the smoke has barely cleared. German gunners slump by their flak batteries, exhausted, haunted by the day's visions. Pilots file their reports, frustration etched into their words. The Americans have brought something new to the war, something the Reich did not expect, a machine that should not exist, a machine that defies gravity, logic, and death itself. And this was only the beginning. Because behind those bombers was not just steel and fire, but an idea that air power could shatter an enemy's heartland, that technology could bring an empire to its knees. The Germans were beginning to realize it, but the full extent of the terror they faced had yet to be revealed. The next chapter of the war would show the world why these fortresses truly earned their name. Summer of 1943. The war has entered its fourth brutal year, and Europe is aflame from the Atlantic coast to the steppes of Russia. The Allies, reeling from earlier disasters, are beginning to gather momentum. In North Africa, Rommel has been driven back. In the east, the Wehrmacht is being bled white at Kursk, and over the skies of Western Europe, a new kind of war is being waged, not by infantry divisions clawing for ground, but by fleets of bombers fighting to decide the fate of nations. This is the stage into which the B-17 flying fortress was unleashed, a machine that promised to carry the war directly into the industrial heart of Hitler's Reich. U.S. Army Air Forces Planning Memo, July 1943. By mid-1943, the United States 8th Air Force had been tasked with nothing less than the systematic destruction of Germany's ability to wage war. Its mission, daylight precision bombing of key industrial centers. The British, scarred by staggering losses, had chosen a different path, nighttime area bombing, to the Royal Air Force. The cover of darkness was the only shield against the Luftwaffe's merciless fighters and flak batteries. But the Americans believed in daylight, in accuracy, in the cold mathematics of the Norden bomb site. Factories, rail hubs, oil refineries. These were to be struck with surgical precision, each blow calculated to cripple the German war machine. RAF Bomber Command Summary, 1943. The doctrine was ambitious, bordering on reckless. Daylight raids meant exposure. Exposure meant slaughter. German defenses were formidable. Over 40,000 flak guns guarded the Reich's skies, pouring up a wall of steel. Fighter wings, Jagdgeschwader 26, 27, 54, stood ready to intercept at a moment's notice. Casualty rates for bomber crews often exceeded 20% per mission, and yet the Americans pressed forward, convinced that the flying fortress could endure where others had failed. The gamble was colossal. But in war, gambles are often the only currency left. USAA 8th Air Force Loss Report, August 1943. The stakes were clear. Germany's industry was a vast web of interconnected arteries. Coal from the Ruhr, steel from the Saar, synthetic fuel plants feeding panzers, aircraft, and U-boats. To strangle the Reich, these arteries had to be severed, and only the bombers could do it. No ground invasion could reach deep enough. No naval blockade could starve the factories quickly enough. It was the bombers, those vast silver armadas, that would become the spearhead of America's strategy. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Opposite them, the Luftwaffe prepared with equal determination. Its doctrine, forged in the crucible of blitzkrieg, emphasized air superiority and concentrated strikes. For the Germans, defense of the Reich was paramount. The Ruhr, Hamburg, Berlin, these were not just cities, but the beating heart of an empire. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, once boastful that no enemy bomber would ever fly over German soil, now found himself presiding over a desperate defense. His fighter command scrambled relentlessly, bleeding itself dry against the endless waves of bombers. Bundesarchiv, Göring's speech fragment, 1943. At the operational level, the mismatch of doctrines became glaring. American bombers flew in tight box formations, interlocking their defensive firepower. Each B-17 carried up to 13 heavy machine guns, overlapping arcs that created what pilots called a flying porcupine. The Luftwaffe, accustomed to picking off stragglers or lone aircraft, suddenly faced entire walls of steel and lead. It was not a single target but a fortress fleet, each plane protecting the other. German aces like Adolf Galland and Walter Nauni noted bitterly that the Americans had created not just an aircraft but an aerial phalanx. Galland Memoir, dramatized composite. The early raids, however, exposed the brutal cost of this doctrine. In August 1943, the fabled mission against Regensburg and Schweinfurt unfolded. 600 bombers thundered into the sky, bound for Germany's ball-bearing factories, vital to every tank, aircraft and truck in the Reich. The Luftwaffe struck savagely. Over 60 bombers were shot down in a single day, hundreds of airmen lost to fire and sky. Survivors returned with wings shredded, engines gone, fuselages ripped to ribbons. The mission crippled German industry, but at a staggering price. Mission report, Schweinfurt Regensburg, 1943. It was this tension, the promise of precision and destruction, against the price in blood, that defined the bomber war of 1943. To Allied commanders, every loss was grievous but necessary. To the Germans, every raid was a fresh wound on their industrial body. Cities that had once been untouchable now burned. Factories that had run day and night now lay silent under twisted steel beams. Workers who had once believed in the Reich's invulnerability now cowered as sirens wailed and fortresses rained fire from the heavens. Eyewitness account, Hamburg, July 1943. And yet, the psychological war was as fierce as the physical. For every German soldier who cursed the invincibility of the fortresses, there was an American crewman haunted by the memory of a comrade's plane disintegrating beside him. For every civilian in Essen who marveled at the machines that would not fall, there was a mother in Kansas who would never again see her son. The clash of doctrines was not fought only with bombs and bullets, but with faith, morale and sheer endurance. Letter from Sergeant Robert L. Clark, 390th Bomb Group, 1943. By the close of 1943, it was clear to all the bomber war would not be short, and it would not be clean. Germany's defenses were unbroken, yet its factories were battered. America's bomber fleet bled heavily, yet its resolve grew sharper. The B-17 had proven itself capable of surviving where others could not, but the cost of every raid left scars that stretched across oceans. In the quiet rooms of strategy, generals on both sides recalculated, reconsidered, and prepared for the next move. And as winter closed in, one truth loomed over every commander, every pilot, every factory worker: the flying fortress was no myth. It was real, it was relentless, and it was only just beginning to show its full power. September 1943. In the briefing rooms of East Anglia, young American crews sit hunched over wooden tables, cigarette smoke curling toward bare bulbs overhead. Maps are spread across the walls, marked with red pins that stretch deep into the German Reich. At the center of every whispered fear and whispered hope is a single question: what makes the flying fortress different? Why do commanders keep sending them back into skies where death lurks at every altitude? The answer, whispered among veterans and muttered with frustration among German pilots, is the same: the B-17 possesses a hidden advantage, one that transforms it from a mere bomber into a nightmare that refuses to die. USAAF Crew Briefing Notes, September 1943. The Germans had expected bombers to behave like bombers always had. In Spain, in Poland, in the Battle of Britain, They had seen bombers shredded when faced with determined fighters. Doctrine dictated that defensive guns were a token, a stalling measure at best. Bomber formations would scatter, morale would collapse, and the sky would be cleared. Yet when the B-17 arrived, it did not scatter. It closed ranks. Box formations, like medieval shield walls, turned the sky into a fortress of interlocking arcs of fire. Messerschmitt pilots dove in for the kill, only to be met with a storm of .50 caliber tracers that clawed at their wings and tore into their engines. Luftwaffe, Ace Hajo Hermann would later remark in frustration, dramatized composite, they flew like an armored fleet, each one guarding the other. A single bomber might be vulnerable, but the formation was a beast with many heads. Bundesarchiv, Hermann Tactical Debrief, 1943. The secret was not merely in the guns, it was in the psychology. German pilots, used to the thrill of slicing apart helpless prey, suddenly found themselves flying into a hurricane. To press an attack meant braving a wall of fire from nose, tail, dorsal, ventral, and waist positions. And if one fortress staggered, others closed ranks around it, pouring fire to cover its retreat. Each kill demanded extraordinary nerve and often suicidal courage. The Luftwaffe began to learn, with growing dread, that losses among their own elite were mounting with unsustainable speed. USAAF 8th Loss Exchange Report, 1943. But the fortress had another hidden strength, its armor and redundancy. German crews who inspected downed B-17 wrecks found baffling evidence. Control cables doubled and tripled, hydraulic systems with backups upon backups, self-sealing fuel tanks that refused to ignite even when riddled with cannon shells. A plane could lose an engine, sometimes two, and still claw its way home across the channel. Stories began to circulate, told in hushed tones, a fortress limping back with half a tail, another landing with great holes in its wings, another that returned with over 600 bullet holes yet every crewman alive. To the Germans, it was an affront to logic. To the Americans, it was proof that their gamble on daylight bombing had a fighting chance. Captured Aircraft Inspection Report, Luftwaffe Technical Division, October 1943. The element of surprise was not just technical, it was cultural. German doctrine assumed centralized command, precision strikes by fighters under close direction. American doctrine leaned on the rugged independence of crews, on their trust in machine and formation. Radios crackled with quick, clipped calls, waist gunners passed bearings in seconds, and pilots kept discipline even as the sky disintegrated around them. The Germans underestimated this cohesion, dismissing the Americans as inexperienced cowboys. What they encountered instead was a new kind of warfare, industrial war in the skies, powered by factories and faith in the fortress. NERA Records, USAAF Command Notes, 1943. For civilians below, the hidden advantage was less mechanical and more terrifying. In Essen, in Bremen, in Hamburg, witnesses described bombers that would not burn. Men on rooftops with flak binoculars would mutter to one another as bomb, after bomb was released, "We shot them, they should fall. Why don't they fall?" Children pointed at smoking aircraft that kept flying, as if invisible hands held them aloft. The psychological toll was immense. Where once German propaganda had assured them the Reich was invulnerable, now the evidence in the sky told another story. The enemy was not just striking, they were enduring. Civilian Diary, Hamburg, August 1943. The hidden advantage was also in numbers. Factories in Seattle and Wichita poured out flying fortresses at a pace that defied comprehension. Each one identical, each one bristling with guns, each one a cog in a machine far larger than any one mission. The Luftwaffe faced not an air force, but an avalanche. A German pilot could down 1, 2, perhaps 3 bombers on a sortie, but for each fortress destroyed, 5 more waited on American airfields, engines warming, crews ready. The imbalance was suffocating. Boeing Production Report, 1943. Even among German intelligence officers, frustration boiled. Reports filed to Berlin carried the same undertone. These machines should not be possible. Their resilience was unnatural. Their formations impossible to penetrate without unsustainable losses. Yet they kept coming. One officer wrote bitterly, dramatized composite. They fly as if armored by destiny itself. Bundesarchiv, German Intelligence Summary, September 1943. By autumn of 1943, the Luftwaffe began adapting, experimenting with new tactics. Mass frontal assaults, twin-engine fighters fitted with heavy cannon rockets designed to blast bombers apart in seconds. And yet, each adaptation was met by the same stubborn reality. The flying fortress absorbed the blow and kept moving. Losses among American crews were horrendous, but enough returned to fight another day. Enough bombs fell to scar Germany's factories, and enough formations held to terrify even the most seasoned Luftwaffe ace. USAAF Tactical Evolution Memo, November 1943. The hidden advantage of the B-17 was not mystical. It was not invincibility. It was something more lethal. A combination of engineering, doctrine, production, and discipline that no single German innovation could fully counter. To the Luftwaffe, this realization spread slowly, painfully, with every raid. The flying fortress was not just another bomber. It was a weapon of endurance, designed to outlast, to grind down, to bleed its enemy not in one blow but in 1,000. And as the raids grew larger, as the shadows of fortresses stretched longer across German soil, the dread of that hidden advantage grew with them. Every pilot who saw a smoking B-17 limp back into formation knew the Americans had built something that changed the rules of the war. The question now was not whether the Germans could stop the flying fortress, but how much they would bleed trying. The winter air over England bit deep as ground crews worked tirelessly beneath floodlights, their breath hanging in clouds as they prepared another fleet of bombers for war. Each B-17, massive and unyielding, bore scars of previous missions, patched fuselages, scorched paint, rivets hammered back into place. But beneath the wear and smoke lay the heart of a machine unlike any other, an aircraft designed not merely to strike, but to survive. Its technical marvels were the hidden language of its resilience, a language written in armor, steel, and innovation. Technical Manual TM 9294, 1943. The Flying Fortress weighed in at nearly 65,000 pounds when fully loaded, a leviathan compared to most aircraft of its time. Its wings spanned 103 feet, their broad surfaces carrying fuel tanks carefully protected with self-sealing linings, engineered to swell and close when pierced by bullets or shrapnel. Each of the four Wright R-1800-2097 Cyclone radial engines generated 1,200 horsepower, propelling the bomber at speeds approaching 287 miles per hour. Not fast enough to outrun fighters, but fast enough to press forward through flak storms. German engineers noted with grim respect that the fortress was never designed for elegance. It was designed for punishment. Captured Aircraft Report, Luftwaffe Technical Division, 1943. Its armor plating was concentrated where it mattered most. Cockpit, bomb bay, waist positions and tail. Crew stations were fortified so that gunners could continue their grim work, even as shrapnel tore the air around them. Redundancy ran through every system. Hydraulic lines were duplicated, control cables doubled, even oxygen supplies were split across separate systems, ensuring that a single hit would not suffocate the men. Where a Messerschmitt might falter with one well-placed strike, the fortress demanded dozens, sometimes hundreds. Engineering Analysis, Boeing Plant Archives, 1943. And then there were the guns. 13 Browning BEM, 2.50 caliber heavy machine guns, mounted in every conceivable position, bristled from the airframe like thorns on a steel beast. Nose, tail, dorsal, ventral, and waist. No angle left undefended. Each gun could spit out 750 rounds per minute, with armor-piercing incendiary rounds that shredded enemy aircraft. A Luftwaffe pilot diving at a fortress faced the same dilemma as a sailor charging a battleship. Every approach was covered, every second exposed meant flirting with death. Crews referred to the interlocking fire as the Ring of Steel, a defense system as terrifying as it was effective. Armament Maintenance Field Guide, 1943. At the heart of the bomber lay the Norden bomb sight, a device shrouded in secrecy and guarded like treasure. This gyroscopic marvel allowed bombardiers to calculate trajectories with near-surgical precision, theoretically enabling strikes within a few hundred feet of their targets from 6 miles above. In practice, weather and flak often interfered, but the Norden gave American crews confidence that daylight raids were more than blind terror. They were scalpel strikes at the heart of German industry. One German officer remarked bitterly after inspecting a bombing pattern, dramatized composite, they could see through clouds through smoke, as if guided by a ghostly hand. U.S. Bombardier Training Manual, 1943. Factories in the United States became the true backbone of the B-17. Boeing in Seattle, Lockheed Vega in California, and Douglas in Long Beach churned them out in staggering numbers. Production lines roared day and night, women riveting steel frames, engines lowered by cranes into waiting nacelles. By the end of the war, over 12,700 fortresses had been built, a testament to America's industrial might. German intelligence analysts despaired as reports reached Berlin of thousands more waiting on airfields, ready to replace every loss. War Production Board Report, 1944. The Luftwaffe sought counters. Heavier cannons, 20 mm, 30 mm, even 37 mm, were strapped to fighters in desperate attempts to crack the fortress's shell. Twin-engine aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 110 and Junkers Ju-88 were adapted into bomber-destroyers, armed with rockets designed to blast formations apart. Yet for every adaptation, the fortress evolved in kind. Formation tactics tightened, escort fighters multiplied, and gunners learned to coordinate fields of fire until the sky itself became a killing ground. Losses remained heavy, but the promise held the bombers would get through. Luftwaffe Weapons Development Memo, 1943. Even the bomb bay itself told a story of scale. Each B-17 could carry up to 8,000 pounds of ordnance on short missions, or around 4,000 pounds for deep strikes into Germany. General-purpose bombs, incendiaries, armor-piercing munitions, all nestled within the cavernous belly, their fuses ticking silently as the plane lumbered toward its target. From 25,000 feet, the release was both mechanical and symbolic. Steel and fire rained from the heavens, each bomb guided by mathematics, each detonation echoing across the Reich's factories and homes. Ordnance Technical Sheet, USAAF, 1943. The crew who operated this fortress were 10 men bound together by necessity: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and gunners for every quarter. Each man depended on the others absolutely. If the tail gunner faltered, fighters slipped in unseen. If the bombardier wavered, the mission's entire purpose was lost. To outsiders, the fortress seemed like an unfeeling machine, but inside, it was a living organism, powered by the sweat, fear, and courage of its crew. Crew Assignment Roster, 390th Bomb Group, 1943. Perhaps the most terrifying feature for the Germans was not a gun or an engine, but the fortress's sheer ability to return home. Tales abounded of bombers landing on 3 engines, on 2, even on 1. Some landed without rudders, with holes large enough to crawl through, with fuselages stitched like quilts from enemy fire. For every fortress that fell, another limped back across the channel, battered but alive. Each survivor became a propaganda weapon in its own right, photographed and celebrated, proof that America had built not just a bomber but a symbol of indestructibility. Stars and Stripes, 1943. The technical genius of the B-17 was not in one innovation, but in the way all innovations fused together. Armor alone would not have saved it. Guns alone could not deter the Luftwaffe. Numbers alone could not force Germany's surrender. But together, armor, firepower, redundancy, production, precision, they created a weapon system that turned doctrine on its head. The Flying Fortress was not just an aircraft. It was a strategy encased in aluminum, carried by engines and enforced by men who refused to break formation. As German pilots studied wreckage, as engineers sketched diagrams, as commanders filed desperate reports, one question burned through every page: how do you kill something designed not to die? The answer was elusive, and every mission proved more costly than the last. For Germany, the arrival of the fortress was not just a technical challenge, it was the beginning of an air war they had not prepared to fight. And soon that war would find its first truly decisive battle. October 14th, 1943. The cold morning sky above England was pale, almost innocent, as crews of the 8th Air Force climbed into their flying fortresses. Engines thundered, one after another, until the ground itself trembled beneath the weight of hundreds of machines preparing for war. Their target, Schweinfurt, the heart of Germany's ball-bearing industry. Without these bearings, tanks would grind to a halt, aircraft would seize, the Reich's war machine would choke. Commanders called it vital. Crews whispered another name, the Black Thursday Raid. Mission Order, 8th Air Force, October 1943. As dawn bled into day, 291 B-17s slifted from English airfields, their silver skins catching the light, their bomb bays heavy with steel and destruction. From the ground, farmers and families craned their necks, watching the procession stretch across the horizon like an endless chain of castles in the sky. Each fortress took its place in the massive formation, a wall of wings and guns. It was a sight that inspired awe among allies, and dread across the Channel. Eyewitness, East Anglia, 1943. The Luftwaffe was ready. German radar stations tracked the bombers as they crossed the coast. Orders flashed across radios, scramble every fighter available. From bases in France, Belgium and deep within the Reich, Messerschmitt Bell 109S and Focke-Wulf 190S clawed into the sky. Over 300 fighters converged on the incoming armada. Jagdgeschwader commanders knew the importance of Schweinfurt. If the ball-bearing plants fell silent, Germany's armies would falter. The Reich could not afford to lose. Bundesarchiv, Luftwaffe Operations Log, October 1943. At 11:20 a.m., the first attacks began. German fighters hurled themselves head-on into the bomber's stream, cannon shells exploding against wings and fuselages. The formations trembled under the impact. One fortress erupted in fire, breaking apart before the crew could bail out. Another spun into the abyss, its tail sheared away. But for each that fell, others held firm. Gunners opened fire, their Brownings spewing tracers that stitched the sky. A Messerschmitt burst into flame, then another, then another. The formation roared onward, a wounded beast but unbroken. USAAF After Action Report, October 1943. Inside the bombers, chaos reigned. Oxygen masks frosted with ice at high altitude. Gunners shouted bearings over intercoms crackling with static. The ball turret gunner, suspended in his glass sphere beneath the plane, watched death streak toward him in the form of cannon shells. He fired until the barrels glowed. Above, waist gunners struggled to reload belts of ammunition, hands numb with cold, blood freezing on torn gloves. Every man knew the odds. They flew not with hope of safety, but with grim determination that their sacrifice would cripple the Reich. Crew Diary, 100th Bomb Group. By noon, flak batteries took their toll. Black puffs filled the sky, each burst sending shards of steel ripping into the formation. A single fragment pierced a cockpit, killing a pilot instantly. His co-pilot, drenched in his comrade's blood, seized the controls and kept the fortress in line. Another plane lost 2 engines, flames trailing from its wings. The crew refused to bail, pushing the crippled machine forward until bombs could be released. The philosophy was merciless but clear: deliver the payload, whatever the cost. Technical debrief, 390th Bomb Group. Over Schweinfurt, the bomb bay doors yawned open. The bombardiers hunched over their northern sights, guiding the formations through walls of smoke and flak. Bombs tumbled earthward in steady streams, their whistles drowned by the roar of engines. On the ground, German civilians scattered as factories vanished in fireballs, steel frames collapsing under shockwaves. Flames climbed into the sky, thick smoke marking the success of the mission even as fortresses disintegrated overhead. Eyewitness Schweinfurt, October 1943. The price was staggering. As the surviving formations turned for home, the Luftwaffe pounced again. Fighters raked through the bombers, their cannon shells detonating in cockpits, shredding wings. Waist gunners died at their stations, their fingers still locked on triggers. Tail gunners fired until their positions were torn open by fire. By the time the armada limped back across the Channel, the airfields of England filled with wreckage and silence. 77 bombers had been lost in a single day. Hundreds of men were gone, missing, captured, or dead. USAAF loss report, Ukt 1943. Yet the mission had not failed. Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants were wrecked. Production plummeted by nearly 40%, sending shockwaves through German industry. Tank assembly lines slowed. Aircraft repairs lagged. Engineers scrambled for substitutes. But even as the Reich staggered under the blow, its skies echoed with grim triumph. The Americans had paid dearly. At such a rate, German commanders believed, the bomber offensive could not be sustained. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. For the crews, Schweinfurt became a legend of fire and steel. Survivors spoke of fortresses returning with wings, shredded, fuselages filled with holes, yet somehow landing on English soil. One plane returned with its tail nearly severed, another with half its nose gone, another with a dead pilot still strapped to his seat while his co-pilot guided them home. Each wreck that landed became proof of the machine's resilience and of the men's unshakable will. Stars and Stripes, October 1943. The Germans, too, learned from Schweinfurt. Reports filed by Luftwaffe commanders carried both pride and alarm. They had inflicted terrible losses, yes, but at terrible cost of their own. Fighter squadrons were exhausted, ammunition stocks drained, fuel reserves stretched thin. If the Americans could sustain such punishment and replace their losses, the balance of the air war might tip. One commander wrote bitterly, dramatized composite, "We have defended today, but if they return tomorrow, how long can we endure?" Bundesarchiv, Jagdgeschwader, Report, October 1943. Black Thursday became both a warning and a prophecy. For the Americans it proved the cost of daylight bombing was brutal, but also that the fortresses could strike the Reich's heart. For the Germans it proved that no city, no factory, no resource was beyond reach. The sky had become the battlefield, and Schweinfurt was its blood-soaked altar. The flying fortress had survived its baptism of fire, but the war in the skies was only intensifying. New tactics, new weapons, and new nightmares were about to descend upon Europe. Winter settled over Europe in 1944, but the skies never rested. Each new dawn brought the thunder of engines, the endless procession of fortresses rising from English fields. For the Americans, Schweinfurt had been a wound, bloody, costly, almost unbearable, but it was not the end. For the Germans, it had been a glimpse of terror, a vision of what awaited if these machines kept coming. The strategic and psychological war was now as important as the bombs themselves, and the B-17 was reshaping both. USAAF Command Memo, January 1944. On the battlefield of the mind, the flying fortress became a myth. To the Allies it was the home-again aircraft, the machine that refused to die. Stories flooded American newspapers. Fortresses landing with holes big enough to crawl through, planes limping on one engine, crews stepping onto the tarmac dazed but alive. Photographs of battered aircraft were paraded as proof of American ingenuity and divine justice. To mothers and fathers in Kansas, Ohio, and California, these images meant their sons had a chance. The B-17 was more than metal. It was hope given wings. Stars and Stripes, January 1944. For the Germans, the myth was darker. Each raid spread whispers through factories and streets. Workers told tales of bombers that could not be brought down, of machines that flew even when burning. Civilians looked up at the contrails and asked one another how many more are coming. Children pointed at the sky with dread, knowing what followed was fire. German morale, once buoyed by propaganda, began to crack. If the Reich's vaunted Luftwaffe could not stop these invaders, what could? Bundesarchiv, Civilian Diary, February 1944. Strategically, the fortress forced a reckoning. Luftwaffe Command poured resources into developing heavier weapons, 30 cannons, air-to-air rockets, upward-firing Schräge cannons, all designed to rip apart bombers. Jagdgeschwader squadrons experimented with head-on assaults, trading survival for kills. Yet the cost mounted. Germany's best aces fell one by one, exhausted and outnumbered. The Reich was burning its elite faster than it could train replacements. The fortress with its relentless defense was bleeding the Luftwaffe dry. Luftwaffe Weapons Development Memo 1944. Allied Strategy 2. Evolved. Escort fighters, long-range P-51 Mustangs, began to shadow the formations. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe found itself caught between hails of .50 caliber fire from bombers and the deadly precision of fighters. Losses skyrocketed. Goering's promise that no enemy bomber will fly over the Reich became a bitter joke among civilians watching fortresses darken their skies day after day. RAF Intercepted Broadcast, 1944. Psychologically, the effect on crews was paradoxical. They knew the fortress gave them a better chance of survival than any other bomber, but the casualty rates were still horrific. Each mission meant gambling with odds that would break most men. Survivors returned pale, their hands trembling, their eyes haunted, and yet they climbed back in, time after time. The machine itself became a bond. Crews trusted their fortresses as they trusted one another. The bomber was no longer just a tool. It was their 11th man, their iron guardian in a world of fire. Crew interview 390th Bomb Group, 1944. For the Reich, the fortress was a constant humiliation. Each time a smoking B-17 limped home, it was a symbol of German failure. Every bomb crater in Essen, every shattered refinery in Hamburg, every silent assembly line in Bremen testified to the same truth: the Americans could reach anywhere. Factories that once fueled the Wehrmacht's advance now struggled to produce. Tanks rolled slower, aircraft repairs lagged, supply chains cracked. Industrial war had found its Achilles heel, and it lay not on the battlefield but in the workshops. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. Yet the impact was not merely material. Captured German soldiers, interrogated after the war, confessed the dread that fortresses inspired. They spoke of watching the sky fill with endless waves of bombers, of the despair that came when flak bursts did nothing, when fighters fell away burning, and still the machines pressed on. One infantryman said simply, "Dramatized composite, we feared them like gods of iron." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Interrogation report. Even among Luftwaffe pilots, the psychological toll was immense. Veterans recalled missions where they emptied their cannons into a single bomber, only to watch it continue flying. They described diving again and again into the ring of fire, losing comrades every hour. For men trained in the myth of German superiority, the experience was shattering. Some began to believe the Americans had built something invincible, something beyond technology. Fear eroded discipline. Caution replaced aggression. The skies belonged increasingly to the enemy. Bundesarchive. Pilot debriefings. 1944. By 1944, the cumulative effect was unmistakable. German industry was crippled. Luftwaffe's strength was collapsing, and the people of the Reich lived under a sky of constant dread. The B-17, once mocked as slow and cumbersome, had become the hammer striking daily against the Reich's heart. And behind each raid, behind each burning factory, lay the greater truth: the war was turning. The fortress was not just an aircraft. It was a symbol that the tide of history had shifted. But as the Germans soon discovered, the legacy of the fortress would stretch far beyond their defeat. For the lessons it carried, in endurance, in mass production, in the marriage of technology and doctrine, would shape not just the outcome of World War II, but the wars yet to come. Spring of 1945. The war in Europe staggered toward its violent end. Cities lay in ruins, bridges shattered and rail lines twisted into useless tangles of steel. Above it all, the flying fortress still roared, its engines droning across a continent that once seemed untouchable. The B-17 had done more than survive. It had carved its name into the very bones of the conflict. Its legacy stretched beyond the smoldering ruins of Germany, echoing into the doctrines of modern warfare and the psychology of nations. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. For the Allies, the fortress had proven that air power could become a decisive instrument of war, not just a supporting arm. The daylight precision doctrine, once ridiculed, had forced the Reich into a defensive war of attrition it could not win. Oil plants, ball-bearing factories, and transport networks collapsed under the relentless blows. Every tank that stood idle for lack of parts, every fighter grounded for want of fuel, bore silent testimony to the bombs carried by those vast silver fleets. The fortress had transformed industrial war from theory into reality. Air War College Analysis, 1947. For the crews, the legacy was written in blood and memory. Of the 12,700 B-17 SEA built, more than 4,700 were lost in combat. Tens of thousands of airmen never returned from their missions. And yet, those who survived spoke of their aircraft with reverence, as though it were alive. Veterans remembered the smell of oil and cordite, the rattle of machine guns, the icy wind at high altitude. They remembered how their fortresses brought them home when logic said they should have died. For families across America, the image of a battered bomber limping into base became a symbol of sacrifice, courage, and endurance. Veteran interview, 390th Bomb Group, 1945. For the Germans, the fortress left scars that ran deeper than rubble. Luftwaffe pilots who had once laughed at the thought of invincible bombers were humbled by endless encounters with machines that would not fall. Civilians who once believed in Goering's promises now cursed his empty boasts as they watched their homes burn. The Reich, which had built its empire on speed, terror, and shock, was undone by a machine that embodied the opposite: patience, resilience, and inevitability. Bundesarchiv, Civilian Testimony, 1945. The influence of the fortress did not end with the war. In the early Cold War years, its lessons shaped the doctrines of nuclear deterrence and strategic bombing. The idea that an aircraft could penetrate deep into enemy territory, deliver decisive strikes, and return alive became the foundation for the B-29 Superfortress, the B-52 Stratofortress, and beyond. Every intercontinental bomber that followed carried a fragment of the B-17's DNA, its focus on survivability, formation tactics, and psychological dominance. U.S. Air Force Doctrine Manual, 1952. Even in modern warfare, echoes remain. The Gulf War's precision strikes, the concept of overwhelming air dominance in the skies of Iraq and Afghanistan, all trace their lineage to the fortresses that once darkened Europe. The principle that connection, coordination, and massed firepower can outweigh brute speed or armor was proven in the skies above the Reich. The B-17 taught the world that modern war was no longer about who struck first, but who endured longest. Rand Air Power Study, 1991. For historians and engineers, the fortress stands as a paradox, a machine both ordinary and extraordinary. Its engines were not the most powerful, its speed not the fastest, its bomb load not the heaviest. And yet, in the fusion of all its qualities, armor, redundancy, firepower, and mass production, it became something greater than the sum of its parts. It was a weapon system, a doctrine, and a psychological juggernaut. No single German innovation could counter it. No defense could fully blunt its impact. Engineering Retrospective, Smithsonian Air and Space, 1987. And for those who lived beneath its shadow, the memory endures. Survivors of bombed cities recall the endless drone of engines, the black rain of incendiaries, the terror of nights and days blurred by fire. Veterans recall the freezing altitudes, the empty seats where comrades once sat, the pride of missions completed against impossible odds. Families recall telegrams that shattered lives, and photographs of weary men standing proudly before battered aircraft. The legacy of the Flying Fortress is both triumph and tragedy, a story of steel and sacrifice inseparably bound. Oral History Project, Imperial War Museum. In the end, the Flying Fortress was more than an aircraft. It was a statement. It declared that technology, discipline, and sheer willpower could change the course of history. It proved that a machine could embody the spirit of a nation, resilient, unyielding, relentless. And it left behind a truth that endures in every conflict since, in modern war, connection outweighs firepower, and endurance defeats speed. The Germans called it Die fliegende Festung. History remembers it as the bomber that would not fall.